So, welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Donald Sloan, and I am chair of the Oxford Cultural Collective. I am in London, and I am joined from not his home, actually his mother's home in the Upper West Side of Manhattan by my friend and colleague, Fred Plotkin. Now, this is actually part of a series of discussions that I'm going to be holding, which we're calling Eating, Drinking, Thinking. And the conversations will be with the various patrons of the Oxford Cultural Collective. Now, all of the patrons are distinguished in their own fields, and they are essentially our international ambassadors. So they are working alongside me to promote the work in the field of gastronomy of the Oxford Cultural Collective. Now, as I say, delighted today to be joined by Fred Plotkin. Fred is a specialist in opera and in all aspects of Italian culture, particularly that country's gastronomy. I guess I would describe him as something of a polymath, great broad range of interests. He is a prolific writer, both of books and in newspapers and magazines internationally. He has worked in opera and classical music for, I hope he doesn't mind me saying, around 45 years. Early in his career, this included a period as a stage director at La Scala in Milan, later as a performance director at the Met in New York City. He is the lead writer for WQXR, which is the United States' leading opera and classical music radio station, which broadcasts out of New York. And just recently, he has started his own series, his own new series, on the Adagio digital podcast and vodcast service, in which he is in conversation with leading figures from the arts. Now, more will emerge, I'm sure, about Fred's professional contribution as this conversation goes on. But Fred, welcome. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm fine, Don. Thank you. I just want to correct one thing. My title at the Met was Performance Manager.
I apologize. Performance manager. Thanks for the correction. So how are things in New York?
The wonderful thing about New York is you wake up and every day is different and all kinds of things have transpired. So let's leave it that it's never dull here. Even under lockdown, it's never dull. And that's how we like it here.
Exactly. Well, let's get into this, Fred. One thing I didn't mention about your biography is that you describe yourself rather intriguingly as a pleasure activist, and I'd like to dwell on that for a moment. How would you define pleasure activist? It's such a singular term.
Well, when I say it, people either smile or recoil, and I immediately reply that a pleasure activist is what you think it is, and the accent is on the you, namely that we all arrive at our own interpretation of what that might mean, and all of it, practically all of it, is valid and fine. For me, it's very specific. It's about the fact that we as human beings have been given this remarkable gift of the five senses, and I believe that we scarcely use them. And there's so much to complain about in the world, but there's so much that remains wonderful in the world that most people don't connect to. There's too much blur and chaos and multitasking and stimulation. And if put in front of a cup of coffee, activate most of my pleasure activism. The sound of the cup, the smell of the coffee, the sight, the taste, the reflection. And it's not just coffee. It could be thousands of different things. It could be a flower. It could be a piece of music. It could be a new person. Let's not pretend people all have their looks, their sounds, the way they move, their smell, whether it's their own personal smell or a fragrance they're wearing, touch. It's all there. And by activating my senses, which is really where the word activist comes from, I experience them more fully. I don't just hear, I listen. I don't just taste, I savor. all of that is so much more rewarding. And when people then say to me, how come you know so much on a particular topic? It's not that I'm smart, it's that I really have always engaged with just about everything I come into contact with. It can be exhausting, but on the other hand, I believe that our accumulation of sensations through our senses leads to another sense, namely the sixth sense, which is intuition. It's connected to memory. It's connected to what kind of thinking we might use to apply to a future occasion. It's how our body works. We are mammals. We were given these senses. And frankly, if a person is missing or is compromised in one sense, that does not mean that he or she is depleted. It usually means that that person has activated other senses more, so that if you have compromised vision or low hearing, Beethoven didn't suddenly lose his other senses when his hearing was gone. He activated those other senses and created masterpieces because he was so completely engaged.
Mm.
Michelangelo, the same, became quite old and his vision got a little bad, but it didn't stop him. Titian, Rembrandt, certain painters late in life lost their vision. And as a result, they kept painting. There were other deaf composers, Smetana and so on. So the point is, we, I believe, lead better, more meaningful, fulfilling lives if we activate our senses, with the result that we have more pleasure.
So would you say then that through your writing and your broadcasting and so on and your teaching, you are advocating for informed appreciation or conscious appreciation of an art form or a flavor or whatever it might be?
Appreciation is a word I tend to sidestep. People say that the books I wrote for learning and loving opera and classical music are books of appreciation. I like something a little more intense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of an intense person, even in my calm nature, but I live with intensity and I enjoy that. That can be exhausting sometimes for people I'm with. I'm sorry, but I believe that it's not about appreciation, it's about engagement.
Mm-hmm.
It's about deriving pleasure and as a result, giving pleasure. It's not hedonism. Hedonism is selfish.
Mm-hmm.
Pleasure is something to be engaged with and shared. If I read a book or if I have an author I love, I'll name an author, the Welsh author Jan Morris. Her writing is magnificent. The topics that she covers thrill me. Her personal story is amazing. And it's my pleasure to share her works with people. She's very famous, but somehow a lot of people don't know her. And her books changed my life. I think that it's incumbent on all of us to share books that have been meaningful for us, because that opens worlds. Every book is a world. I've written 9 books. There are others I'd like to write. And I know the pain and the pleasure of writing them, but I know, because I see it, when people talk to me, how they feel touched
Mm-hmm.
by my writing, because in effect, I was speaking directly to them. My writing style is not necessarily literary, but it's very constructive, but it's also very personal and very passionate.
Mm. It's interesting what you say about this active engagement, if you like, in order to fuel pleasure. With respect to food and our relationship with food, do you think that we've increasingly become dictated to by formulaic diets, by food as entertainment and so on, all of which might undermine our ability to draw true pleasure from food?
Well, let me tell you where I come from on this. It's a very deep and meaningful topic for me, as you obviously know. I believe that food is a right.
Mm-hmm.
It's a privilege in the sense that we receive it, we enjoy it, we should respect it, we should love it, we should share it. There's a wonderful Italian expression, a tavola non si invecchia, you don't get old at the table. By sharing food, it means that you are living life.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll be blunt, I grew up in what we now call disadvantaged circumstances. We were broke, and food was not readily available. And I, in America, we used to call it relief. My grandmother was on relief, which
Mhm.
meant that she received government rice and government cheese and government peanut butter. And that's what I ate when I visited her. And somehow I became mindful very quickly that we were not the only people in my neighborhood in Brooklyn who didn't have enough to eat. And we ate, I'm not complaining, but it was hardly the experience that people assume I come from. Foodie is a word I don't use. We know a fellow named Paul Levy in
Mm.
Oxford who coined the term in 1984 as a negative term, namely someone who wants to be up on the latest trends.
Yeah.
But it's not about awareness, engagement with food, with agriculture. I'm one of the founders in Italy of the slow food movement, which still, I believe, adheres to its principles. It's been
Mhm.
corrupted by outside people who want to give it a different spin. But Carlo Petrini, who is the head and founder, really was the one who articulated that food is something that everyone is entitled to. When I was growing up, we always said, finish your food, because there are people in Armenia, India, China, South America, name the place, who are starving and don't have enough. So apart from anything else, it taught me how to reuse food that were leftovers,
Mhm.
how to take care of ingredients, how to understand, before it became trendy, seasonality, and why I would look for certain foods in certain seasons. As I became more interested, I learned that nature presented us with these foods at different times for different needs. So that things like asparagus and artichoke that come in late winter, early spring are diuretics. And nature wants them there so that we can get off some of the winter weight and liquids out of our system. Citrus in the winter, when it comes, provides vitamin C, provides a bit of fresh taste in the mouth. It's all there for a reason.
Mhm.
And so I'm not a proponent of flying foods around the world for the most part. Coffee and bananas are exceptions. But most foods we should have locally and seasonally. And our berries here in New York that we have basically from June to August are delicious. But then I freeze them, I put them up, I preserve them. Same with tomatoes in the fall. I don't want a tomato that arrives from thousands of miles away with no flavor. And it's also about caring for the earth. I was green before this terminology existed. I've made many life choices that reflect that. For example, I've never owned or operated a car. I walk, I use public transport. I have traveled the world mostly using public transportation. I don't know how to drive a car, so that I've traveled 5 continents using public transport. And that's how you meet people. And that's how I, especially in Italy, but not only, have been invited to people's homes. Hospitality is a wonderful thing that we undervalue. We think of it as something you learn in food service school, and we do. But on the other hand, hospitality is about those nice people who have very little but insist on sharing it with you. And I can tell you 1,000 stories, Don. I'll just tell you one. When I was a student in Italy, I was a teenager. I began early in Italy. When you took trains from one city to another, they were often late, they were often slow. You never knew how long it would take, and you never knew who you would meet. The compartments had 6 seats.
Mm.
You would bring along enough food to share with the other 5 people. That was the custom.
Mhm.
So that when I would travel, say, from Bologna, where I was living, down to Naples, where, let's say, I wanted to work or study or whatever, I would pack a lot of food from Bologna. And people would get on the train in Florence and bring Florentine food, and get on the train in Rome and Roman food, and then coming back, Neapolitan food. And I made friends. I would say, Signora, how did you make that? What is it with?
Mhm.
And I learned a lot of my recipes, frankly, on Italian trains that led to
Mhm.
invitations. This is hospitality. This is humanity. This is food sharing, and it's not foodie.
And it's
It's
authentic.
culture.
It's authentic. Yeah. Let's stick with Italy, because obviously, you know, throughout your career, you have become a very powerful ambassador for Italian culture in the US and elsewhere around the world. Possibly an easy culture to fall in love with: the food, the music, the architecture, the people, the weather. But what for you is it about Italian culture, that mix of aspects of Italian life that really captured your imagination and have sustained your imagination over 40 or 50 years?
Thank you for 40 or 50 years, 64 years, Don. um, 40 years ago, I had already lived there for 5 years. No, I was fascinated with Italy from the time I was a very small child. I had heard about Venice, and Venice being a city with no cars and so on, and being what it was. I saw images, and I asked my father to tell me about Venice. He had never been. And he started bringing home books and pictures and artwork about Venice. And I was interested already in opera. My dad was a musician, and I had gone to opera from a very early age. And opera, though born in Florence, grew in Venice.
Yeah.
And I became a Venetian Renaissance history major, really to have the foundations for studying and working in opera. I lived in Italy for a very long time because I always wanted to. My mother took me there before I began university in the States, and it was love at first sight. At the age of 8, we had the World's Fair in New York, and Michelangelo's Vatican Pietà was brought here. And while most kids wanted the waffles and the corn on the cob at the World's Fair, I wanted to go back every single time to see the Pietà. I was fascinated by this remarkable thing that I just didn't understand. And my dad said to me, you know, when it goes back to Rome, you're going to have to go to Rome to see it. And most of his works are on walls and ceilings or statues. They don't travel. And although I intended in a vague way to go to Italy, it became my goal then to go and see all the works of Michelangelo. And among my 1,000 passions are that I've traveled the world and I've seen every extant work of Michelangelo everywhere in the world, whether it's a drawing that is owned by the Queen of England, whether it's a little sculpture in St. Petersburg, whether it's a cartoon that he did that's in Detroit. I've seen them all. And
we're back to this intensity again, aren't we?
Oh God. But I find it fulfilling. I refer to Italy as the compliant muse. In other words, whatever it is that you want to learn about human civilization, it can teach you. If you're interested in paper making, it's there. I can send you to places about paper. If you are interested in architecture, another one of my heroes is Vitruvius, the ancient Roman architect who believed that everything had to have utilitas, usefulness, firmitas, strength and durability, and venusta, which is beauty. And I've come to discover that whether Italians realize this or not, every single thing that they do, whether it's a window display, the making of a shirt, anything, has durability, usefulness, and beauty. And when those become the underpinnings of a worldview, most Italians don't articulate that. I don't think they even get that. I try to explain it to them. And yes, there are ugly shopping malls that Silvio Berlusconi enabled, and Italy's not perfect. But in its imperfection, we learn so much.
It's a rather beautiful observation, but how does it translate into the Italian character, not just the tangibles of Italian culture?
Well, because everything, whether they articulate this or not, has to have meaning. It has to have a function. There's another wonderful Italian word that doesn't really translate into other languages, dietrologia. Dietro means behind or within, that which is not seen. and ology. So behindology, withinology.
Yeah.
And what it really means is that everything we see on the surface is not everything that there is. So that when Michelangelo or Leonardo did anatomy studies, they wanted to understand why a muscle turned in a particular way, why a bone structure on a cheek was as it was, everything. They wanted to know the dietrologia when they did painting and sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
An Italian architect would design something understanding that it has a life and a structure and a purpose within it. When I make a dish of pasta or pork loin or you name it, it has structure, it has beauty, it has a philosophy, if you want to call it that. I don't think Italians call dietrologia philosophy. Dietrologia has a negative context as well, namely that it must be that the Vatican or the mafia or the government or someone, they use this expression, is
Almost, yeah.
manipulating the controls, that there's something behind it. But the positive view of dietrologia is that everything has an inner life and a structure.
Mm.
And the Italians talk about la vita interiore, the inner life. We have a received image of them as being very boisterous and extroverted and so on. Some of them are. Many of them are very reserved. They're very observant. They're very cautious in their approach because Italy has endured terrible suffering. They've not only in terms of war and invasion and plague and pest, but earthquakes, natural disasters. Italy is very prone to earthquakes. And Italians, for example, we don't think of them this way, are among the highest savers of money in the world because they are familiar with the downside of what happens. You just have to read Dante's Inferno and you get it all.
Let's turn our attention to one obvious aspect of Italian culture that you have majored on, which is opera. Now, in a previous conversation that we had, you described it to me as the most complete of all art forms. Tell me what you meant by that.
Well, I was not borrowing from Wagner, who thought he invented everything, and he coined the term Gesamtkunstwerk, which means total work of art.
Mm-hmm.
I would point you sooner to the men in Florence who were part of what was called the Camerata Fiorentina, who in 1597 created an art form. So opera is new compared to many art forms, apart from film and photography, in that it drew from antiquity. You can have poetry, you can have acting, you can have singing, you can have dance, you can have instrumental music, you can have visual arts, you have light, all of which, when you combine them together, creates what they called an opera lirica, a lyric work. We just call it opera, but in Italy, they still say opera lirica. And this began in Florence, but it really took root in Venice, as I described, and the first great capital of opera was Venice for about a century in the 1700s. And people came from all over Europe to study opera and learn opera in Venice. And Handel took it north to Germany and then England. French people took it, Viennese took it, Russians later took it. And all of it is opera, but in different forms. And we can still do it today. One of the million great things about opera is it's live. And you are in the presence of an unamplified voice or voices of singers in concert with 70 to 100 musical instruments, a conductor. That's just the sound. This is pleasure activism par excellence. There is the scenery, the visual, the storytelling, the emotion. We can do stuff in opera that people feel within in life, but don't permit themselves to express. That I feel myself smiling as I say this. Anna Russell, the great observant comic, said, you can do anything you want in opera so long as you sing it. So that, the whole range of human behavior, from nobility to evil to incest. Wagner wrote the Ring Cycle, and at the core of it are a brother and sister have sex and produce a hero, Siegfried. we don't encourage that in daily life, but somehow in opera, no one seems aghast at the fact that Sigmund and Sieglinde pull off their clothes after singing for an hour, have at it. He then dies very soon thereafter. She has a baby, and she dies. And then his aunt, I have to keep track of this, Brunhilde comes along 18 years later, or he comes along and finds her 18 years later. They fall in love, not knowing that they're aunt and nephew. None of it matters, because what's below it is great human passion, great human frailty. So we could do 30 hours on opera, Don, but the key is it's about who we are.
Well, that's just what I was going to get onto. You described the magic and the magic of opera very vividly there. The risk is it's sometimes perceived to be for those in a particular demographic and doesn't reach out, in a sense, in the way in which I guess you hope it will. Talk to me about its relevance. In what way does opera reveal, as other art forms do, aspects of the nature of our life, our lived experience and so on? How relevant is it to today? And is there a perceptual problem in that respect with opera?
Well, frankly and respectfully, it's always been described as only for the few, the privileged, whatever, only by those who don't know it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it is a popular art form. By popular, I mean it's for and of the people. Yes, in Vienna, in Paris initially, it was for the court, for the nobles and so on. But in Venice, in London, and Hamburg, it was always from the beginning for the people. And Italians attended opera the way nowadays, before the advent of streaming, we would go to a film on Friday nights. It was popular music, popular stories. We knew the music, and the opera stars were glamorous in the way that the movie stars were. And because they can do things that very few other people do. So in basketball, if you have a Michael Jordan or a LeBron James, or in football, soccer, you have a Maradona, or you name the person, a David Beckham, who can do things that most people cannot. We thrill to that as human achievement. The only difference with opera is it's not mediated by technology terribly much. It is still the great human endeavor, the way soccer can be as well. And so if we are open to that, if we are open to being emotional, if we are open to ourselves, I remember when I was a very young man going to see La Boheme here at the Met, and I saw a very elderly couple attending it, holding hands, and they were moved yet again by the death of Mimi that they had truly seen many times. And I spoke to them after, and they said, well, we met at the Metropolitan Opera. We attended a performance of La Boheme. We fell in love with La Boheme. We were young lovers. Now we're old people. And what happened, this was the interval, after the performance, the man died of a heart attack at the Met, and I was the person who tended to him. So opera is a deeply personal thing. You can't be superficial and like opera. So part of it is that the audiences bring an intensity that you don't find in something more passive when you sit back and look at a screen, television. It's just not the same experience.
Yeah. The arts, opera included, have obviously faced a tough time recently, Fred, with our current public health crisis and so on. In certain spheres, what we have been through recently has stimulated a creativity. It's forced us to think about other ways in which we connect with audiences or customers or whatever it might be. Has the same happened, would you say, within the world of opera and the arts generally?
Well, a particular challenge, yes, Don.
Well,
sorry.
Could that lead to a new form of resilience emerging, even stronger, emerging in a more creative way?
Well, right now, and we're speaking in June of 2020, it's strictly medical.
Yeah,
because
we're still in that phase of survival.
Of course, we know from churches and so on, where they're all singing loud and a lot of spittle is coming out of their mouths and so on, are carriers of the virus. And people cannot gather. We've seen in churches in Korea, in Arkansas, and other places, in the UK, in Amsterdam, that people have contracted the virus by singing in choruses. So for the time being, I think a lot of mono operas or non-choral operas, and I'm sorry about that. Similarly, we may not be able to gather an orchestra. I worked at the Met, and we lost a violist, a wonderful man, and we just lost a wonderful conductor named Joel Rebson, who was a very dear friend of mine with whom I worked, to the virus. And Milan lost an artistic director. This is happening. It's real.
Yeah.
So we have to think of health and safety first. Within that, I know that there will be adaptation. I know that opera singer friends of mine have created, excuse me, stuff online. But we always say in opera, the singer must be heard. I would also add, the audience must be heard.
Mm.
We audience members stimulate the singers to be better. They react in real time to our reaction to them. And it's not just applause. You can have complete silence in the theater, and the singers know it because they're feeling us. And I'm getting goosebumps as I say this. There is this exchange in the theater, this physical reaction that happens in an opera house and in classical music, and in different ways in spoken theater.
Mm-hmm.
I think spoken theater can come back sooner in a different context because of many factors that are not involved there that we have in opera.
Yeah.
But anything with a musical component that's not a solo is going to be a problem. So I think this is a period, yes, of desperation, and in my country, certainly, loss of income, not only for the companies, but especially for the artists.
Mm-hmm.
And they're locked in their homes. They're concerned about the virus. We all are, or should be. And I keep in touch with a lot of them and try to encourage them. And that's part of why I've had them every Friday with Fred Plotkin on Adagio, is to get them out of where they are and into the larger world.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn our attention now to food education in particular, which is something else that you've been involved with for a great deal of time, and obviously is something that the Oxford Cultural Collective progressively will be more engaged with. There is more of a history of gastronomic education, food studies, if you like, in the US than there is in the UK. And those of us who are involved in this world would see studying food as a perfect entree into understanding people and geography and aspects of history and so on. But it may be seen by many as a bit of a niche sport, a bit of an area only for a few. What would you say is the value of food education that you have observed over the years?
Well, let's start with food culture as opposed to food education. No, I'll start the other way. When I was a high schooler in New York, I went to the Bronx High School of Science, and that's produced Nobel Prize winners and inventors and physicists, and Stokely Carmichael, the black leader, and a few, Bobby Darin, the singer, and me, who are not traditional in our ways. But a very meaningful course to me there was taught by Mrs. Shapiro. It was nutritional science, not so-called home economics, but how food transforms when cooked, how we digest food, nutrients and what it does to our system. So that my approach has always been about food and health, not about food and trendy, not about food and foodie, about clean agriculture, about erosion of soils and the cleanliness of water and all of that. Water is food. Water gives us our food, so that we have to protect water. I come from that, and I teach that first when I teach food, because if we don't understand that, and if we just see it as a cut piece of meat or fish or pre-chopped vegetables that we find in a plastic wrapper at the grocery, that's not food. That's food preparation. And anyone can learn to prepare food, but I would rather teach them how to chop a carrot. It tastes better if you chop it at the moment than if it was chopped in France 2 weeks before and shipped to you. And I teach it from the ingredients, from the fundamentals. I don't try to make it intimidating. It's not supposed to be. I am what's known as a home cook. And the overwhelming majority of people in the world are home cooks. I'm not a chef. I've consulted to restaurants, but chefs and the restaurant world is a different thing. And I love it for what it is and what it offers, and for the hospitality and all of that, and often for the preservation of food culture. But it's not the way most people live. We've created this middle ground that right now is prominent, namely prepared foods to take away. Whether it's a restaurant that does a curry that you take home, or Chinese food,
Yeah.
whether it's your supermarket that has pre-made meals for you to heat up in a microwave. I don't own a microwave. I don't want a microwave. I believe in cooking. And so if we learn that the ingredients are our friends and we honor and respect them and what they can give us, we are better served, we're better nourished, and we're protecting the earth better. And we can make really good food. I would say, Don, that what you were referring to about the culture of food and the study of food, maybe it's a bit posh and so on. On the contrary,
Not at all, no.
My generation of people, and there are many of us in the food world, are particular because we went to the places where people made their food initially. If you know Aglaé Cremezi, she's magnificent in Greece and traveling around and visiting old people and learning their secrets from them. I did this in Italy. I was famous for chasing old women all over southern Italy. Signora, how did you make that? What did you do? And frankly, the knowledge that I gathered when I began this in the 70s, and have been doing ever since, is not about being foodie. It's about preserving a culture and a civilization, not of fanciness. But I wrote a book called La Terra Fortunata, in which I interviewed women who were born in the 1890s, who prepared food that they brought to the front in the First World War, that served the Italian soldiers, who at that time were fighting alongside the French, the British, and the Americans at the Austrian border, and how they survived and how they fed the troops in winter. This is not foodie. This is culture and history. But frankly, some of the foods that they made are really delicious, and I eat them and I serve them. And one old lady, her vision was outstanding. She was 105, and I asked her why. She said blueberries. Now it's commonly accepted. We know why, because of the antioxidants. But at that time, 40 plus years ago, she just knew that blueberries were good for her eyes. And because they only came in a season, she preserved blueberries throughout the year and ate them every day in different forms. So these nuggets of information from the people who live it, from the farmers, from the poor, are the people. This is our culture and our civilization. I would just add one more thing, Don. I'm always mindful that there are maybe 1 billion people in the world now who don't have food. And we can never forget that. It has to be a huge part of the way we live and the way we are stewards of the land and the way we share our food. Frankly, people complain about mass migrations and exoduses and so on. If people had food and stability where they lived, they wouldn't necessarily feel they had to migrate.
Yeah. And it may indeed be that as we discover and become more informed about challenges to the global food system and the consequences of our mismanagement of that system, that food education becomes more mainstream, and the protection of culture in the way in which you describe becomes more appreciated and more understood. Yeah. One final thing, Fred. We've talked about your passions. We've talked about the nature of the projects and initiatives in which you're involved. You've also had to navigate a career as an independent operator. It's one thing being passionate about opera and being, developing your understanding of food and culture and so on, but what have been your sources of motivation for working independently in this rather nebulous field? I mean, just learning, to work independently. You've got more practice than I do, but what have been your sources of motivation and inspiration for leading that kind of professional career?
Well, when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, an institution I love, by the way, do not get me ever wrong on that. I was a boss. I had more than 350 staff members who reported to me. And I worked in budgets in the millions, and I liked it and I did it well. I love the institution. I used to joke that, my memoir would be called Doing It Nightly, because every night was different. Every night was a new experience. But I just knew that within me, the Greta Garbo side of me wanted to be alone. I wanted to be, I adored it, but I wanted to just pursue my passions. I had had some illness and injury as a kid, and I never felt necessarily that I would have a long life. And therefore, I had to do carpe diem. I had to do it right away. And I knew very well that adore the Met and adore opera, though I do, that there was so much else that I needed to do. The thing I most love in life, apart from the people who are dear to me, is travel. And frankly, my COVID experience is that I'm not traveling, and I won't be traveling. And in fact, the last trip I made, the last person I saw before I flew back to New York was you in London on the 7th of March. And that, it's a challenge, but therefore I travel within. I'm not going to my memories. I'm not that kind of person. But there are inner journeys you can take too without sounding too hippy-dippy about it. But exploration is good. And we can explore in other ways, frankly, as I'm looking after my mom, I am exploring the kitchen again in ways that I did not necessarily, in that I prepare meals here. I gather food just from very local sources. I never had to build a larder, a pantry here, because it always existed. More than 30, 40 years ago, I learned from Italians and from my grandmother that you keep food in because you just don't know. So therefore, not sure if I answered your question, but the thing is, I call myself a man of 1,000 passions. And it's not dilettantish, it's deep love and commitment and interest. And the answer ultimately, Don, is time management. That you need to understand, to prioritize, and then to reprioritize. If something that seemed important to you a month ago now is just not so important, put it aside and do the thing that you care deeply about. With that, of course, is always the commitment to others. I don't want to sound like I'm selfish and self-involved. That's the hedonism. The pleasure activism is the creation of betterment for others. That's immensely rewarding. Be loving. Be loving is really the means to being happy.
Well, you've been navigating that career, Fred, with great style, and in doing so, bringing a great deal of pleasure to other people. It's been great, as always, to talk to you, Fred, and I'm sure those listening, watching will have appreciated getting an insight into the way you think and the career that you are leading. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, and be well, all of you.